I want to welcome everyone. Thanks so much for turning out. And this is the celebration, as it were, of a dossier we published this spring in Film Quarterly on Asian American film and media at 50, celebrating a range of anniversaries. And that's in our current issue of Volume 3, Number 3, our spring issue. And I have to do just very few thanks because this was originally going to be an event on the material plane in Los Angeles. And so thanks to KJ Reith and Paul Malcolm at the UCLA Film and Television Archive, and the folks at the Hammer Museum where we were going to meet, and to Janet Chen and Lindy Leong at the Asian American Studies Center at UCLA, our original sponsors for this panel, and to my co-editor of this dossier, above all, to Brian Hugh, my co-moderator today. And at Film Quarterly, they're behind the scenes right now, but Rebecca Prime, our associate editor, and Mark Francis, our assistant editor, have been essential to getting this dossier together. And it lives online now, which we'll flag to you at the end of the session. And thanks to the Ford Foundation for their support, especially Just Films, to Chiwei Yang and to Kara Mertes for supporting Film Quarterly over the years, and for making events like this possible for us to try to, to really help us in taking scholarship to the public, and really trying to bring smart, progressive thinking by these fabulous, brilliant scholars, trying to bring that to a broader audience and make it more widely available and outside the walls of academia. So it's thrilling to be here with all of you today. And 2020 was supposed to be just that. It was supposed to be, 2020 vision, this great moment of looking at these significant anniversaries, the 50th anniversary of both visual communications and of the Asian American Study Center at UCLA, the 40th anniversary of CAM, the Center for Asian American Media, it used to be NATA, the 43rd anniversary, I guess, of ACV, the Asian American International Film Festival, and Asian Cinevision, as it was originally founded. And we wanted to do an issue that looked back at those histories, but also looked at what's happened since from the perspective today of 2020. This was conceived and published obviously before this current moment that we're in, but we'll get around to that. We have time to kind of take that up. And before I pass this on to Brian, I just wanted to say a word about the background. We each have sort of chosen a background image, and I picked Who Killed Vincent Chin, this still image from that, because back in the 1980s, I was in a different life. I was running the film program at the New York State Council for the Arts, and I was actually able to give some of the initial funding for them to make Who Killed Vincent Chin. So that was really fun, and I thought, why not mark that moment today with an image? So that's it for me for the moment. And Brian, on to you to talk about this dossier and this fabulous panel and this whole field.
Thanks, Ruby. Well, since you're talking about backgrounds, I'll share mine. This is not my actual home. This is from H.P. Mendoza's I Am a Ghost, and I wanted to pick this because CamFest is immediately after this panel. They're doing a 10th anniversary sing-along edition of H.P. Mendoza's film Fruit Fly. And also the DC APA Film Festival is currently showing H.P. Mendoza's I Am a Ghost, and they have a Q&A with him tomorrow. So I figured not only do I get his incredible art direction, but it's a way to plug his films. Okay, so as Ruby mentioned, we've put together this issue to celebrate these anniversaries. But it was also really exciting to realize that we were doing what seems to be the first edited collection, whether as a book or as a journal, dedicated to Asian American film history. There have been plenty of edited collections on Asian American cinema in general, but to focus specifically on history to us seemed special and like a good time to do it. We're definitely building upon the work of Glenn Mimura's Ghost Life of Third Cinema, Jun Okada's Making Asian American Film and Video. And what we wanted to take stock of this moment with these anniversaries as a way to consider why now should we be focusing on history. So for one, I think those anniversaries remind us of the institutional histories of organizations like Visual Communications, CAM, Asian Cinevision, especially at a moment where a lot of these institutions are under threat from defunding, where there's different kinds of competition that's kind of putting them in precarious situations. And also, like right now, this challenge of moving things online. And many of these institutions rely on film festivals for sustainability, for community engagement, and what does it mean for them moving forward? And so in thinking about their histories, we could think about kind of what's at stake in preserving these and maybe helping these organizations continue to evolve. It's also, as we mentioned, anniversaries of key moments in the Asian American movement. The last few years, there have been celebrations of the San Francisco state strikes for ethnic studies, the establishment of Asian American studies departments and centers all around the country. And then with that, in the last few years, there's been a lot of research, a lot of oral history that provides important context for film historians who are doing the work of looking into Asian American film history. So I think it's a particularly useful time to now think about Asian American film history. And then, of course, just the last decade or so much discourse around newness. That we've been talking about Asian American cinema, Asian American media in terms of new media. And anytime you talk about new media, it begs the question, what is old media? And how do we study old media? Are there continuities? Are there discontinuities? And then, of course, with, I guess 2 years ago now, so much discourse around firstness, around Crazy Rich Asians. And of course, any of us who've kind of observed the scene for a while, whenever we hear first anything, we roll our eyes a little bit and say, remember your history. So, and part of it isn't just to tell the young people to get off our lawns, but it's also because we don't want to continuously reinvent the wheel. That how do we gain traction and learn from the past so we can continue to evolve and move this Asian American cinema forward. And also, and lastly, I think it's just a nice reminder that writing history is such a pillar for why Asian American cinema exists to begin with. To document community histories, personal histories, cultural histories. And so in that spirit, we should document the histories of the documenters. So we definitely feel like we are kind of working in a spirit of the filmmakers themselves. Okay, so we know that we started to dig around and see what scholars, what they've been working on. We know there's been great work because we see these presentations at SEMS, at AAAS. So we figured let's bring them all together in this collection. And we immediately found that there were way too many scholars and great new research than we had space for. So we put some limits around how we were defining it for the purposes of this issue. So for one, we decided to start with the post-Asian American movement era. So really focusing on the generations of filmmakers that were sort of self-consciously Asian American. So 1970s onwards. And secondly, we thought it was important to focus on independent cinema. And while there's a lot of great research on Asian Americans in Hollywood, both sort of above and below the line, we thought it was, especially in the spirit of the Asian American movement, to focus on the independent filmmakers and the communities that circulate around those films and their makers. Although in one of our cases, as we'll discover, one of our contributors is talking about how the history of independent cinema can actually help us understand what's happening with the mainstream today. And we're really thrilled to have pretty much all of the contributors of that issue here with us today. So Ruby and I are going to switch off introducing them, and they're each going to share, just quickly talk about their contribution to the journal, and then since many of them have also selected a Zoom background, we'll have them tell us why they've picked what they've picked. Okay, so I'll start things off. So I wanted to introduce Josslyn Luckett, who is an assistant professor of cinema studies at NYU. Her piece was on some of the forgotten early filmmakers who came out of UCLA and were affiliated with Visual Communications. So Josslyn, take it away.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you so much for Ruby and Rebecca, everyone who's helped with this, and for Ruby for having faith in this work of mine. First, about the image, that's Lawson Inada from the early Visual Communications film, I Told You So. And I have to say that I actually saw a clip from that film in Arthur Dong's documentary Claiming a Voice about visual communications. So it's a nice full circle with Oliver's piece too. What struck me about Lawson in that piece was seeing him as a jazz poet, strut down those streets of Fresno. And my work in my PhD in Africana Studies at UPenn was initially about jazz. And so I'm also excited. So when I saw him strutting like that, I said, who is this poet? He's looking as fierce as Amiri and the Last Poets and all that. I have to find out who this person is. And so I looked him up because he was the poet laureate of Oregon. And I wrote to the Poet Laureate's office to see if I could find Lawson. And they told me that he doesn't do email, but we'll print your email and we'll mail it to him. And he called me, which was great. So the greatest gift of this research has been to become pen pals with this man, Lawson Inada. I also bring up this film because this was the first film that June Kuramoto and Dan Kuramoto, who become the band Hiroshima, scored for visual communication. They become kind of like the in-house musicians for the early VC films. So that's important too. And so with June as a composer in this film, that gets me my segue to the Asian American women in this moment. A lot of the early history that I was finding about visual communications, of course, emphasized the 4 founders, who are fantastic. 3 of the 4 I got to interview and know. I brought Dwayne Kubo to UPenn and Robert Nakamura to UPenn for screenings. But I kept hearing this name, Betty Chen, and so I wondered who was this person, and sometimes her name would even be misspelled. And so I wondered, how can I find out more about her? And so it really was a process of digging to find any work of hers. Luckily, the UCLA Film Archive, Mark Quigley, I want to give him a shout out. He helped me find 2 of her early student films. So I was able to find the film that I talk about in the article, which was a short animated piece called Young Girl, Portrait of a Young Girl. And it begins as this beautiful animation. You feel like it's the portrait of a young animator, you know. It's kind of psychedelic. It feels very, you know, late 60s, early 70s. And then suddenly it's this devastating cut to animation of soldiers aiming at a young girl. And that is Alison Krauss from the Kent State killings in 1970. So it was suddenly the alarming and exciting work of a very political filmmaker. So I thought, who is this woman and how do I get to know more about her? And what was beautiful as I started to find out more of the filmmakers that were involved with visual communications in the UCLA group, and I'll stop for a second just to remind everyone, a lot of you know this already, but at UCLA in the late 60s was the beginning of this thing called the Ethno-Communications Program, which was an affirmative action initiative that brought multiracial students together to make films about their communities. Unfortunately, a lot of times when this history gets remembered and presented, it gets presented in silos, and that multiracial part gets forgotten. And so one of the really interesting things, once I dug into who were these UCLA film students, it turns out that there were actually more Asian American women in the program in the earliest years than there were Black women, Black students. So when Julie Dash, Alili Sharon Larkin, Barbara McCullough, and Carol Parrott Bloom come to UCLA around 74, 75, 76, well, there had already been many Asian American women who had been making films there, either directly in ethno, or they were like Betty was. Betty actually predates the ethno program, so she was the teaching assistant for a lot of these young filmmakers. And in fact, she was, as you see in this photo, you see Eddie Wang and Dwayne Kubo here. She was their TA. She was Robert Nakamura's TA. So it's important that she was their teacher, and they all testify that Betty was their teacher. So, so that's really the reason for getting into this. this article was to kind of dig more to find out who are these women? Did they create a space for the next generation of women of color to come to the program? Were they working collaboratively or not? In some cases, I found out that they did. I got to meet Lillian Wu, and she worked with Marie Kodani and Geraldine Kudaka on her thesis project. So there was some working together. And last but not least, on the cover of the issue, it's hard to see because of the funky lighting, but you can see Mary Uematsu Ko. She's on the cover, and she also gave me that great photo that you saw earlier of Betty Chen. She was a student, and there she is. Well, this was a kind of infamous photo of her. She's the one in the center doing her thing. Hopefully she's watching, I don't know. But Mary also gave me such great histories of these women, their activism, what they were working on. Mary Ko was actually working on a film about Asian American women's movement that Betty Chen did the voiceover for. It's lost. I hope that she'll dig it out and restore it at some point so we can have it. But so I say in the piece, this is really just a beginning to hopefully fuel curiosity and hunger to dig deeper about this incredible group of women filmmakers. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, Josslyn. That was fantastic. And I just want to introduce, coming up next in the order that we cooked up, Viola Lasmana, who's going to be talking about her article that she did for us, Love and Amateurism in Kelly Loves Tony. And she's looking at Spencer Nakasako's wonderful 1998 documentary made on and with Kelly Saturn. And she's really reconsidering the whole question of the amateur and a world of professionalism, as you'll hear. And Viola's a postdoc fellow, is that right, in the Departments of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California, and working on a book, Shadow Imagination, Trans-Pacific Approaches to Post-1965 Indonesian Archive. Thanks, Viola. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Ruby. And thanks, Brian, and of course, the whole Film Quarterly team for making this virtual panel happen. So happy to be here with all of you. And I have to say, I'm really honored to be part of this special dossier with such amazing scholars. So thank you for that. So first of all, so the student background that I have in here, similar to Ruby's. So this is related to Vincent Chin. I don't know if you can tell the banner here. So this is from 1983. It's the Day of Remembrance for Vincent Chin in San Francisco, Chinatown. And even though my article is not about Vincent Chin specifically, I decided to use this as a Zoom background, one as a tribute to Vincent Chin, because it was, 4 days ago was his birthday. And so another kind of anniversary to add on to what Ruby and Brian had said about anniversaries this time around. And also because I think, this is still very much relevant, right? Anti-Asian racism continues in this COVID-19 moment. And also, like, one of several things, one of the things that I think the murder of Vincent Chin highlights for us is that it reveals how shaky and how false the Asian American model minority narrative is. One of the things it does is it, of course, leaves out groups of people supposedly under this Asian American umbrella, right? So it leaves out certain groups of people still within Asian America. So this brings me to my article, which is about Spencer Nakasako's film, specifically Kelly Loves Tony. The title is Love and Amateurism in Kelly Loves Tony, and I'll be happy to talk about that in greater detail during the discussion. But so Kelly Loves Tony is the second in what a lot of people refer to as the Refugee Trilogy or Video Diary series. So Kelly Loves Tony is the second one of this series. The first one is, of course, AKA Dawn Bonus, which won an Emmy. It came out in 1995. So again, another anniversary. 2020 is the 25th anniversary of AKA Dawn Bonus. A.K. Dalmonas is also in the poster that Film Quarterly, circulated for this webinar. So, Spencer Nakasako spent spending about 20 years or so working with Southeast Asian refugee youth in the Bay Area, from about like the 90s to 2012 or so. So it's a long time, that he spent time with them to teach them how to make films using camcorders in order to document their lives. And this one in particular, Kelly Loves Tony, is this coming of age story, you could say, about Kelly and Tony. They're both, becoming new parents, right? You can see this photo of Kelly and Tony there with their kids. So they're in the brink of adulthood. They're becoming new parents, but also new sons and daughters-in-laws. And a lot of what this film also deals with is Kelly's own kind of struggles and grappling with how to achieve the American dream, because she really does believe in it. So you see kind of what she aspires to be, and that's a huge part of the film. And that's one of the things that really drew me to this one in the series, is that this one out of the three is the only one that focuses on the perspective of this young woman, Kelly, and what she goes through. So it does give us a perspective into a window into the gendered experience of refugee life in America. And a couple more things that I just want to highlight about Kelly Loves Tony and Spencer Nakasako's work is, this, I think the role and the rhetoric of the amateur is something that I write about in the article. I'm really fascinated by this, like how it's used aesthetically, but also politically. So, and also how Spencer Nakasawa's work, I think, has to be considered within not just Asian American film and media history, but also media histories at large, right? So this kind of, I love this image. And there's another image from Kelly Loves, this is A.K. Dalmonas here with his camera, this famous photo. There's also many scenes in Kelly Loves Tony in which Tony holds up a camera to mirrors. So this kind of like self-documentation is really, I think, a very interesting part of these films. And when I've taught the Spencer Nakasako's films to my students, I don't have to say anything. They just pick up on it right away, and they say, oh, this is an early form of vlogging, right? So I think placing this in the larger trajectory of media history is not only interesting, but also important, because Asian Americans are usually left out of this kind of the larger media history, so you're either kind of not part of this media history. So one last thing that I'll just say about this Kelly Loves Tony, but also the whole Video Diary series is, these are films that are really made about community and by community and with community. And that's one of the things that I really spend some time in the article talking about. And I think that's really important also in terms of the current moment. So thank you.
Thank you, Viola. Next, I'm honored to introduce Oliver Wang. He's professor of sociology at Cal State University, Long Beach. So for the issue, Oliver conducted an interview with the filmmaker, author, Arthur Dong. So Oliver, tell us more about it.
Yeah, sure. Well, welcome to everyone. This is such an honor to be part of today's panel, and I'm so thankful to the folks at Film Quarterly for including my interview with Arthur in their special dossier. I think most people who know my work at all are familiar with me writing much more about Asian American music, but I actually have a long history with Asian American cinema as a journalist, as a film festival selection member and judge, and as someone who used to teach the Asian American film and video class at Berkeley, about 20 years ago. A class, I should add, that I took at Cal as a student back when Spencer Nakasako was teaching it. So I like all the kind of intersecting layers that we have going on today. And it was in that class that I first saw works by people like Rhea, like Renee, like Arthur, I think all of who are amongst the attendees. So, no pressure here. In any case, I don't stay as current with Asian American film as I used to be, but it's still a subject that's very near to my intellectual and personal heart. And so the background to the piece I did, the interview I did for Film Quarterly was a few years ago. Arthur Dong contacted me about helping to serve as an editorial consultant on the book version of his documentary Forbidden City, USA. And then last year, he did the same thing when he was working on the book version of his documentary Hollywood Chinese. And again, that book just came out last year. And my image in the background of the Zoom background is actually a still that was part of, that was in the book. It's from the 1946 Esther Ng film, Lady in the Blue Lagoon, which was shot in California. And I believe on the left is Lai Yi, in the center is Esther Ng, and on the right is Wong Hock Sing. In any case, I've been familiar with Arthur's work since the 90s because of movies like Sewing Woman were the type of things that I would have seen in Spencer's class. And they were very much part of my formative education in Asian American cinema. But until I had worked with Arthur on his two books, I hadn't realized how much his perspectives on Asian American film were often a little bit different, I think, from the conventional wisdom that circulates within Asian American studies, which is sort of where my background came from, especially when it comes to issues around race and representation. We get into some of that within our conversation in the quarterly. I certainly would not describe Arthur as a contrarian, but as he details in Hollywood Chinese, a lot of his thoughts about race and representation as it pertains to Asian Americans are informed by the fact that he grew up in a predominantly Chinese American enclave. He grew up in San Francisco, Chinatown, and that as a result of that, he had really amazing access to Chinese films because of the number of Chinese specific theaters that were in and around the Chinatown area, which meant that for him, he grew up surrounded really by Asian faces on the big screen, which was, I think, very different for those of us who didn't grow up near Chinese theaters in the US. And in any case, I think given both Arthur's storied career, which I think absolutely fits into a discussion about the history of Asian American cinema, given all of the things that he's contributed to that, as well as his perspectives on Asian American film, I thought he would make a very compelling interview for the special issue. And thankfully, Brian and Ruby both agreed and did not think that me doing this was going to be a conflict of interest. I just want to add one last thing, is that one of the sad things about us having to cancel the in-person panel for March is that after the panel was supposed to have been done, we were planning on having drinks at the Formosa Cafe in West Hollywood. And Arthur curated the backroom exhibit there, which is all about the history of Asian Americans in Hollywood. And he does so in what I think is a brilliantly subversive way. So whenever it is safe again for folks to go out and go to bars, I really urge people to take a trip to the Formosa Cafe and check out that back room and the Hollywood Chinese exhibit that Arthur did there. Thank you.
That is great. Thanks so much, Oliver. Coming up next, we're going to hear from Lan Duong, who has written on the Archives of Memory, Vietnamese American films past and present, and is really looking at Vietnamese American film festivals and diasporic representations as the kind of construction of a counter archive. And she's an associate professor in cinema and media studies at the University of Southern California, and she's the author of Treacherous Subjects, Gender, Culture, and Trans Vietnamese Feminism, and as well as many, many articles widely published. And she's also a founding member of the Critical Refugee Studies Collective and co-editor of that series, Critical Refugee Studies at University of California Press. Lan, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, first of all, I also want to give a shout out to Film Quarterly and Ruby Rich, Brian Hu for allowing me to participate in this conversation that means so much to Asian Americans, I think, and Asians and Asian Americans at this moment in terms of this crisis and the anti-Asian and anti-Asian American racism that we see, that we're seeing every day. And I also want to say that I wish I had, I wish we could go to Cafe Formosa. We just have to delay that, but yeah, that would be very nice. So my piece has to do with what I was noticing in my research on Vietnamese cinema. And that is because I was going to the archive in Vietnam for 15 years now, and witnessing what this archive was saying, the state archive was saying about film, the country's history, its revolutions, and its struggles. And it struck me that there was so much present within this archive, but there was also a lot of absence in terms of South Vietnamese history, in terms of Vietnamese American history, what kind of films were being made in South Vietnam during the First and Second Indo-Chinese Wars, and then finally, anything to do with Vietnamese Americans or refugees. And so because of that, I decided, or I wanted to shine a light on Vietnamese American films, and specifically the Viet Film Fest in Orange County that originated in 2003. And I wanted to talk about Vietnamese cinemas as being transnational, but specifically Vietnamese American cinema through the lens of a refugee aesthetic and thematic. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the films that I had seen, if you look through my article, it goes from 1996 with Em Chinh Nguyen's Xích to Nguyen Nguyen Le's Nước, which came out in 2016. So within that roughly 20-year time period, we really have a lot of different themes, and the film festival, Viet Film Fest, has really been the site for this kind of conversation to move forward in very important and inclusive ways. So speaking of Nguyen Nguyen Le's work, I wanted to put up as my Zoom background the poster for their work, Nước, and because I think the film speaks to me and the refugee sentiment and aesthetic that I see riven in a lot of these works that are coming out of Vietnamese America. And also I wanted to bring into the fore the kinds of LGBTQ issues and representations that are also being forefronted within the space of the film festival. So opening up the discourse around these issues with the community and reflecting some of the concerns and issues that are brought up in the films themselves, and how important that is to keep that kind of conversation going in the community. So finally, what I end on, and this is the subject of my second book on Vietnamese transnational cinemas and what I call the archives of memory, is that this archive in Vietnam, in the state, it has a very specific narrative of itself. And I thought that what was needed was a kind of counter archive, or a kind of different way of thinking about archives, about the Vietnamese American archive that was different from the Asian American Film Archive, but also different from the Vietnam State Archive, and the US Film Archive on the Vietnam War. So between all these different national cultures, I wanted to specify how Vietnamese American cinemas work, and specifically how the site of the film festival, specifically Viet Film Fest, becomes this site to bring thousands of attendees together, thousands of filmmakers and producers and writers and collaborators from all over the world to talk about this thing called film, and how wonderful this film festival is in doing that. It hasn't been easy, its formation and its funding structures and its politics, some of the politics of which I've had issues with, but at the same time I recognize that it has a great value in highlighting communities' memory that is different from US national culture's memory of Vietnam, and the Vietnamese memory of the Vietnam War as well. So I think on those points about memory, community, and the archive, I wanted to bring a much needed emphasis to a different kind of community film festival space.
Thank you, Lan. I can't wait for your book. This is going to be a really important contribution. Next up, and last but not least, I wanted to introduce Melissa Phruksachart. She is a doctoral fellow at the University of Michigan. And the piece that she contributed for our issue was really the one that takes us to the present. It looks at the discourses around the 2018 films Crazy Rich Asians and Searching, but always with in mind the legacies of visual communications. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you, everybody. I want to start, of course, by thanking Ruby and Brian for putting this issue together, and also to thank especially Rebecca Prime and Mark Francis for their work on this issue behind the scenes, and also to Chris Ree for her labor in producing this event. So when Ruby and Brian pitched the idea of celebrating 50 years of Asian American cinema, I was interested in thinking about how much the priorities and investments of Asian American filmmaking had changed since VC's inception in 1970. And so when the Asian American movement formed, it noticed that the term Asian American could bring with it specific critiques of racism, imperialism, war, capitalism, and so forth. And that those were made available through the lens of Asian American experiences and histories. So as film scholar Sylvia Chong has shown us, for example, the Vietnam War on film and in history looks totally different from an Asian Americanist perspective than from a white one. So VC was, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, anti-war, pro-worker, and as Josslyn's work shows us, it was woman-led and feminist, and it was unafraid of exploring alternatives to capitalism, right? So VC is a nod to the Viet Cong. And I think contemporary Asian American activist movements today still hold those values. But my article argues that contemporary mainstream Asian American filmmakers and journalists by and large don't. And yet they control much of the narrative that the general public sees. And so the concerns of my piece might be really familiar, over familiar to people in Asian American literature, literary and cultural studies circles, but less so to people in sort of general film circles. And that's why I decided to write this piece. So I look at two films, Crazy Rich Asians and Searching, to try to get at a contradiction that I see happening. That these films are being celebrated in the media as really big wins for Asian American communities, when in fact, the films and their hype machines serve to consolidate the social, political, and financial power of a certain class of Asian American elites and elite aspirants in the media. And that's really the media strategy that doesn't get reported on. So I term this the bourgeois cinema of boba liberalism, a kind of Asian American cinema that makes really clear its desire to participate in normative and boring forms of the political and social status quo. And this is really the opposite spirit that VC started when it invented itself. And it's also the opposite of the radical politics and aesthetics celebrated in other articles in this issue. And so I continue to elaborate that this sort of cinema operates with two major strategies: messianic visibility and color muteness. So I argue that messianic visibility kind of too easily and too flippantly equates feeling quote unquote seen or being quote unquote represented. And those are both terms I'd love to further unpack. So being seen or represented in mainstream capitalism as psychological and emotional reparations for racism. That somehow you will be or have been saved by finally getting media representation. And I don't want to minimize the power of cinematic identification, but the language of being saved is one that I'm sort of suspicious of, which is why I call it messianic visibility. And there's something like libidinal that needs to be unpacked, and hopefully some of the smart people here in the audience can help me do that. But moreover, what's really interesting is the thinness of these media representations in comparison to the wide range of feelings and experiences available in Asian American literature and poetry, for example. So Kristen Werner calls this plastic representation in another issue of Film Quarterly. So she argues that plastic representation is basically characters that are just basically bodies that signal diversity. They aren't actually interesting characters. And I add on to that by saying that messianic visibility is basically the desire for that. And Warner notes that it's up to the viewers and to fan labor, basically, to produce the thickness of these characters in online discussions, when we actually deserve writers who can give that to us in the first place. I then look at Anish Chaganty's film Searching to think about the bourgeois cinema of boba liberalism through the idea of color muteness, a term coined by Michael Pollack to denote a lack of language around race. So it's not that you do see race, you're not colorblind, but you can't or won't talk about it. And I was interested in how Searching was marketed as proudly not about race, yet also proudly made by immigrants. And I found something very kind of nefarious about those twinned prides. So I look at the technical and aesthetic innovations in Searching and in Chaganty's short film Seeds to consider how color muteness in the film is supported by Silicon Valley's desire for frictionless, algorithmic logic, and the usual sort of endless capitalist greed. And basically what I wanted people to come away with was a sense of the critical possibilities of Asian American cinema and Asian Americanist critique beyond the idea of assessing whether the film was accurate or not. Because when everyone's a critic, radical contextualization can be really important. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was great, Melissa. That was great, everyone. This is so thrilling. One other note before we get on with the next part of this program is that this is not the end of anything Film Quarterly is ever going to do on this subject. That should be obvious, but just to flag the next issue, due to timing, there's a little series on PBS called Asian Americans that didn't make it into this issue. So the next issue is going to have June Okada on Asian Americans and also a piece by Denise Kaur on a career interview with Renee Tajima Pena, who's in the house, as is Mary Kyle, by the way. So poster girl in the house as well. So this is terrific. The structure we've come up with after these introductions of everyone's articles is for Brian and myself to periodically throw out some questions, allow crosstalk between the panelists, and think about the work they're doing and what it means to this moment. And this is also an opportunity for any of you who have questions for the panelists to enter those into the Q&A, and Brian and I will be sifting through and forwarding ideas to the panelists as we go along. But just to start, I'm wondering from all of you, what do you think about this historical work being conducted now at this moment that you did not anticipate when you began your research and did not anticipate when you were writing for this issue? What does it mean to be doing history now in this pandemic moment? And if any of you have any thoughts on that. And if not, we'll move on to another question. Brian, I think you just, yeah, go on.
I have just to note that the film festival that I write about, the Viet Film Festival, they have had to postpone. So we don't have that face-to-face type of interactions, and I think that's a huge loss. But I think, and I hope that we'll be able to get together again. But it just, in that kind of very visceral way, that had to be canceled. And so we just don't have that space that I was talking about, that communal space to even get together. And again, that's a big loss.
Can I just jump in here? Because, you know, I'm someone for whom film festivals are so important. So this moment is particularly acute for that reason. not that it's not acute for people who are unable to work or eat or live, but in terms of our field, film festivals have been so primary. And I noticed that they've been especially important in terms of Asian American communities and Asian American film. And so I wonder if anyone wants to add to what Lan just said about that.
I mean, I'll try to make this brief. I mean, a few thoughts that come to mind is one that for a very, very long time, I mean, the reason why the festivals were so important, it was the only space outside of, let's say, an Asian American Studies class, you were ever going to see any of these films. I mean, maybe PBS or other kinds of public television would program stuff that we were talking a little bit earlier about Spencer's works. But for the most part, because there was, you know, especially for this issue, we're focusing on independent film. I don't need to state this, but I will anyways. It's really hard for it to get distribution and to find an audience. And so festivals, in a lot of cases, would be the only space in which you could ever see this stuff. And what I'm also thinking about too with the pandemic is that we're now spending, at least I know I am and my family, we're spending a lot of time watching streaming services. And on the one hand, you know, Netflix in particular, there's any number of Asian American related or produced or directed television series or movies that have come out there. I oftentimes think about the kind of media landscape that my 15-year-old is growing up with as opposed to what I had as a kid growing up in the 1980s. And it's very different on the one hand. But on the flip side, I think it still comes back to this issue of access because, well, what shows or what movies end up on Netflix or on Amazon or on Hulu, as opposed to a lot of the films that we're talking about here, or those kinds of filmmakers, do they have the same access? And even if we are supposedly living in a phase, an era in which all of this media is supposed to be available to us in concept, I think in practice, you're still seeing it being funneled through very specific outlets. And then it's basically access still remains an issue. So that what we have now is we don't have access to the film festivals, not in person at least, and a lot of them are trying to do stuff virtually. But it just kind of accents the point that, you know, large corporate media still is the primary way in which people see or get to choose what we get to see, is what I'm trying to say.
I would just say that this has been a particularly challenging time to teach these films also, because so many of us, if we're lucky enough to have access to a DVD, well, I don't know how about you, but my administration was strongly encouraging non-synchronous learning for this period. And so, but I still insisted on hitting play on my DVD in my computer of Cruising J-Town and making my class sit through it, because I didn't have yet. I will make the announcement though that a lot of those films are now on New Day, but we weren't able to get the streaming. We didn't have the budget to get the streaming and all of that in time to show for the class. So it was really a disappointment to not have a lot of the films that we would normally show old-fashioned style through a DVD or even a VHS. I still show some of those. But also I was thinking in terms of doing history. I mean, a lot of my research, you know, was made available again through Abe Farrar at VC, literally going to the office and having them put the DVD in the computer and me watching and taking notes. And so, but with all the travel bans and everything closed, you know, none of that is possible. I really feel for the PhD students in all of our programs whose, you know, really important research is not able to happen right now, because so much of what we're trying, this archive is precious, a lot of it. And if we can't get into the building, you know, it's lost.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, you know, all of what Josslyn, Oliver, what you've just said really resonate with what I'm thinking about too, is that I was thinking about it this morning. It's like, how are you going to teach these films if you don't have institutional support, right? You know, if you're lucky, you have access, your institution has access to things like streaming services like academic video online, for instance, which at USC, where I'm at, they have Spencer Nakasako's films, for instance, right? Otherwise, there's no way for me to access those films and be able to teach those films. So thinking about how to access these films in the pandemic, but also the importance of having that kind of institutional support too, right? In just making sure there is continuity in being able to teach these things in the classroom, which is so important to kind of balance out what students are getting in mainstream media, like what Melissa was talking about, the kind of Asian American representation they're seeing nowadays, to balance it out with what we're teaching in the classroom so that they get a different sense and a more expansive sense of Asian American films and media. And the other thing that I just wanted to say is that one thing I didn't expect after having written this article is I had a student who just did a quarantine film, she calls it. And when we were talking about her video, she said, I was really inspired by Spencer Nakazaka's films and the kind of, and how, Kelly and AKA Don Bonus and Tony, how they document their everyday lives. And she said, I want to see what happens. I don't know how I'm going to do it yet and what will happen. But I said, just, go with it. So I think in terms of the pandemic and the lack of access, the lack of, kind of the more restrictions that happen that we have, that might be a really great challenge to have, but that was sort of one of the things that came about, and in terms of creative expression, and how that relates to my article. The student, it was kind of wonderful to see how the student used that for her work.
I'll just quickly add that I'm not really someone who goes to a lot of film festivals. So for me, the pandemic has allowed my participation in those spaces to expand because they've gone online. So, getting to see films through, CAM and through the Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival, has been a really good opportunity. And so I think going back to what Brian said about the kind of institutional history, I'm just really grateful that those institutions are still here to be distributing the media right now.
And then anybody who's ever done Asian American film history knows very well what Josslyn is talking about, sitting next to Abe Ferrer and going through the history. And it goes to show that Asian American film history is always hard to do, not just under quarantine. And I was hoping that some of you can talk about the specific challenges of doing Asian American film history. I know that when I was in graduate school doing film studies, they just told us, yeah, you want to do film history, go to the archive, go to the Warner Brothers archive, go to Fox's archive. They have everything for you. Or we have decades of movie magazines and trade journals. But where do we start with Asian American cinema? And also Asian American cinema is even seemingly relatively recent. Like the 1990s is not that easy to, I feel like it would be easier for me to research 1940s Hollywood than it would be to do independent cinema of the 1990s. So maybe, Josslyn, if you want to start by talking about some of the challenges that you specifically encountered while doing your historical research. And then I wanted to break it out to everybody else as well.
Yeah, I guess I might just be repeating that, as I said, the two films by Betty Chen were only on real film. So Mark Quigley at the UCLA Film Archive had to make a video copy for me. And so all of that takes time. If you're scheduling a trip from Philadelphia to LA, you got to wait for the copy to get made and all of that. But I have to say too, this is challenging to talk about, but I think some of this research that I was doing, because of the sort of multiracial aspect, a lot of interesting things got revealed about how let's see, how can I say this? Sometimes it seemed like the people who were doing the scholarship about Black cinema didn't know as much about the Asian American cinema, and vice versa, and even or Chicano cinema for that matter. And my example is that at UCLA, there were films that were not at the film archive, that were not even logged in, but they were at the Chicano American Center, or they were at the Asian American Student Center. And so, but it felt like the centers weren't even communicating about what was available. And so that gave me some insight that maybe people don't think that there's a person that wants to see all of that work. And that's a real sadness for me, that's not a conversation that's happening across the campus, so that professors even know what's available across the campus. Yeah, so there are challenges, and I'll just say one other thing too in terms of that silo issue. It's been fascinating to go to a conference like SCMS and mention that I'm doing work on the ethno-communications program. Well, I find that young Asian American and Chicano students, they know about the ethno-communications program, but they've never heard of the LA Rebellion. When I talk with young Black students, they've heard of the LA Rebellion, but they never heard of the ethno-communications program. And so the fact that they don't know that all of those filmmakers were together at one point is again this loss that I think is happening because of these silos. And so I really am a silo buster. I'm trying to be a silo buster with this research.
And I just want to point out to everybody that there's great commentaries in the chats, and that Renee has been emphasizing that you all, people who are in the university, need to be supporting filmmakers and get them to do Q&As by Zoom now that we're in this new world, and pay them. And Abe Farrar's been on there saying, go to New Day Films to see the VC work. And Renee's been saying, you know, go to Alexander Street, go to Canopy, use these services so that there's an income stream back to the filmmakers. So we have the most amazing audience going on here, I just want to say. But as we dive back in to hear from the rest of you, Viola, I just wanted to see if you were interested in marking the other anniversary that you had mentioned to me, having to do with Yuri, the other birthday this week. I think it was you that brought that up. Having to do with Yuri Kochiyama, wasn't that you?
Yeah, and you know, I mentioned that because I've been thinking, you know, just in anticipation of this panel, thinking about Asian American film and media, thinking about, you know, the murder of Vincent Chin and how it's still so relevant today because it's not just about anti-Chinese racism, but it becomes like anyone who looks Asian, is perceived to be Asian, is at risk to be violently attacked, whether verbally or physically, right? And so and then it's all these confluences of different anniversaries and Yuri Kochiyama's work, you know, with Malcolm X, and then just thinking about all the, you know, like Grace Lee Boggs and her work with Black social justice, you know, so and so in the heels of what Josslyn just said, you know, I think because this issue too is also, you know, inspired by Glenn Mimura's work in, you know, bringing together Asian American film with the history of also third cinema and LA Rebellion. I think what I was thinking about, the reason why I mentioned Yuri Kochiyama is because so in this current moment, in the pandemic, we're seeing not just anti-Asian racism, but also so the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, for instance, right? So we are seeing the bodies of not just Asian people, but also Black and brown people who are very, very much at risk because of the pandemic. So I think this is a really it's a rich moment for us to be thinking about across, you know, ethnic lines and racial lines. So that's what I was thinking about.
Great, great. And I was just, in terms of Yuri Kochiyama, I just wanted to give a shout out to a former student of mine, Tad Nakamura, who did a beautiful, among all of his other feature docs, did a beautiful tribute to Yuri made for the memorial that you can find that has footage of her edited to the Blue Scholars, and it's just beautiful. So there's that too.
Brian, in regards to your question, I didn't write about this in the dossier, but my book project is a history of Asian Americans on television in the 50s and 60s. So it is, you know, like in terms of my doing historical research, you know, not only is television like often far less archived than film, and especially like on the production side of things. And so I guess in order to really try to get at that history, I tried to just use the tools that were available. So like IMDb was, I don't know, like I couldn't have done the work without IMDb. So rather than like watching films and then trying to figure out who was in them, I would just look at IMDb and then look at somebody's career and then work backwards to then try and find like every film that they had been in or every episode that they had been in. And I also relied a lot on, you know, just these, I don't know, random people on YouTube who, for some reason, like upload clips of movies, you know, clips of TV shows, just kind of like that, again, like that fan labor, and how they contribute to the archive. So I guess, you know, looking at these kind of popular archives rather than just official ones. And it really made me think about the importance of like tagging, and I don't know what the like official word for it is for librarians, but you know, Asian American like concerns or Asian American actors or kind of plot lines or anything like that just like aren't tagged in library searches. And so I think about how much easier it could have been if any of my key terms would you know, give me a result. So that's also something to think about for archiving in the future.
Also a reminder how important Asian American studies is to create the kind of vocabulary for us to even have these keywords.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear from Lan on this question of challenges with archives. You're dealing with multiple archives on different continents. Can you talk about the challenges for your own work? Oh, you're on mute, by the way.
Okay, thanks for the question, or the prod. But everybody's comments are so productive. So I'm thinking there's so many resonances here, but just to tag on, one of the ways that I'm trying to think about the archive is to think about different archives, as Melissa's talking about, and then going back to other people's comments, the lack of institutional support, what does that mean? And thinking through how there are different archives to be tapped. And one of the things that the pandemic has allowed us to do is just be in front of our screens a lot. But even before the pandemic, I would find some of the things that Melissa talked about, which is that there would be Vietnamese American cinephiles who would upload pre-1975 South Vietnamese films on YouTube. And then the affective response would be so great because the nostalgia was there. People were responding to this different formation of an archive and archival memory. So I thought that was, that's important for me to address in terms of thinking about different types of archives and memories. But in terms of the scope of the book and trying to think through different archives, I do situate the Vietnamese archive as opposed to other archives, the Viet Film Fest being one, but then also the digital archive that I'm finding the Vietnamese diaspora as a whole are contributing to. I've been to the archives in France and the archives in the US, and for me, part of the thrust of the book is to critique the institutions of power that really make up Vietnam War discourse, and how power and funding have really allowed some works to be highlighted as opposed to others, and received and create a certain community for them. So for me, it is so much about institutions and access and capital. So.
And so far in this, we've talked a lot about different like objects of history, like objects that we can be researching, the films, the papers, but Oliver's work, and then Josslyn's too. I mean, I think Josslyn, your original version of your paper was a lot more about your hunt for Betty Chen and finding these people. And I think it's so important to think about the role of oral histories, of being able to talk to and doing interviews. And Oliver, your piece was an interview. And I think this ties also to Renee's comment in the chat, which is let's bring the filmmakers to the classrooms because there's so much we can learn that way too. So if any of you can, especially Oliver and Josslyn, maybe talk about the advantages or potential disadvantages of doing interviews.
Josslyn, you want to go first?
Okay. Well, the interviews have been my favorite part of this research. Even when, you know, they end up with roadblocks, but each person helped me sort of get to the next. So I did have amazing interviews with Eddie Wong and Dwayne Kubo and Sylvia Morales. They gave me tips about, memories of Betty Chen. Eventually, I talked to Mary Yui Matsuko. And then I got to talk to Laura Ho also too, who I feature in the piece. So digging, I just didn't, I wouldn't let anything stop me. I just tried and called random places and got through to people. And I think that has value. I mean, I know that sometimes there's questions in academia about those kinds of sources, but I think it's absolutely the most important source because they're the ones who made the work. Why aren't we honoring the people who actually made the work and hear their version of things? So I was really gifted with that. Luckily at UPenn, I did some fundraising across departments and got some money to bring some of the filmmakers to Penn also too. So yes, Renee, I brought some, I put some money in some filmmakers' pockets and got it. And I hope that when money frees up again at our universities that we can do that again. It's really important. Yeah, so I think the interview piece is really critical, and I've loved it. The thing though about Betty is that you have to face sometimes there are people who don't want to be found. They don't want to be. So it's still a mystery for me. I really hope it's a mystery that this article could begin to solve, that someone will write in or holler at one of us and say, I actually saw Betty yesterday. She's doing okay. Here's her email, whatever. It hasn't happened yet, but we'll see. Maybe it'll happen.
I mean, to answer your question, Brian, and to fall, go off on some of what Josslyn's saying. I mean, I love doing interviews. I think my background as both a scholar and a journalist is I'm very dependent on interviews as being the primary way in which I collect information, not the least of which that as a scholar, I tend to focus on subjects that have not been studied very well at all. I'm confronting a lot of this, including stuff related to the archive, to kind of go back to the previous question around a new project that I've been working on for the last few years around Japanese American car culture in Southern California, which is, on the one hand, I think on a colloquial basis, I think a lot of people are aware that Asian Americans are into cars, and especially within the Nikkei community, it's not unusual for people to have stories about the importance of the family car, or people who, as teens, would customize cars or have racing clubs and this sort of thing. But you look within the annals of Asian American studies, so I'm not even talking about at the grand institutional basis, I'm talking about within the discipline that's supposed to be looking at marginal topics. This is on the margins of the margins. And anyone who knows me knows that I've been on this kind of soapbox for years, that Asian American Studies has done, I think, a very good job of looking and studying Asian American literature. I think it's done a decent job of looking at Asian American cinema. And then any other pop culture topics outside of that, I mean, it's poor. It's not just, well, what am I trying to say here? I mean, I think it's a real issue within the discipline, number one. And to bring this back to the question of interviews, I mean, part of the frustration that I've had is that part of the community that I would like to be able to focus on in this new project would be people who were around in the 1940s and 50s. But of course, those people are all dying, if not already dead right now. And the fact that no one previous to me, and I'm not even Japanese American, has ever thought to look at this topic previous is just, it's sad, it's kind of infuriating, and it oftentimes has made me question, in the almost 30 years that I've been an Asian Americanist, like, what the hell are we even doing in terms of all of these different stories that we could have been collecting and that we haven't, and then now we won't be able to because those people are gone and we're losing them every day, least of all like now, right? So sorry, that's my little rant around sort of the kind of margins of Asian American studies.
Yeah.
As it relates to this stuff.
No, that's great. I wanted to go back to Melissa because I think you had something to add about the construction of the archive, Melissa.
Oh, sure. Well, actually, I also wanted to add to Oliver that that's a question that I've been thinking about for my book, because there is so much, conversation or kind of like mainstream discourse about how Asians are invisible, or there's no Asians on TV, there's no Asians in the movies, but we know that there were. And why wasn't that better better documented, more written about. And, I'm kind of trying to think about the role of like, I don't know, of embarrassment in how that history was constructed, and how those kinds of portrayals and those kinds of performances they really became these like bad objects that the resistant subject then like formed itself on top of. And yeah, then we kind of lost the opportunity to really interrogate that history, and in a way that I think like Black Studies has done a much better job of thinking about histories of minstrelsy and other kinds of performance in that era. I think Asian American Studies like has sort of really marginalized that class of performers. But Ruby, in what you were saying, I was just, to the archive question, I was thinking about how so much of the work that we do in Asian American cultural studies, I think broadly writ, is to construct the archive itself. So Josslyn like reconstructing the ethno's work back from from the silos back to the collaborations that it originated in, or Lan thinking about a Vietnamese American archive as like a legitimate archive. And I was also remembering when I taught at Hunter in the 2010s, like our archive was just this DVD binder. Like some of them were like legitimate purchases and some had been like ripped illegally. But that was really all we had, and that's sort of like where we're working from.
We're beginning to get some really interesting questions that I want to start funneling to the panelists, because we've reserved a lot of time to talk amongst ourselves, but I think we can let the people here in the room in on that. And I can't resist this one. From Darian N., who's curious about the panelist's view on the farewell. So I was going to wait and save this for the end, but let me bust in here for a minute and say, all right, far away from what we're discussing, far away from the topics that you've written on. This was published this was conceived in the pre-farewell moment. So any thoughts on that? Anything any of you want to say about that?
Melissa mentioned it. Yeah, I was just going to say, Melissa mentioned it in her piece, I think.
Yep. Melissa, back to you.
I don't think I did. But anyway, I thought someone might ask me, are there any films you do like? And so I decided to think of some films that I did like. And I liked it for the way that it built its foundation on like intergenerational love. Because one of the most tired narratives in Asian American filmmaking is this conflict between, the quote unquote traditional Asian parents and like the supposedly modern American children. And it's always told, from the child's point of view, so that the parents come off as like really pathological and backwards. And, even really charming films do this, like, Bend It Like Beckham and, Blinded by the Light. And The Farewell showed that people actually do love each other across that kind of difference. So I think I really like it for the way that it challenged that narrative.
Well, it's kind of a return to filiality, isn't it? In a sense, going way back. Yeah, great. There's also another question for you before we move on to other people, but this is from Denise Kaur, who's writing for our next issue, Melissa, on how does the difference between independent cinema and commercial Hollywood cinema play with your converging political formulations that you discuss, like in terms of the categories you're putting forward, who are you directing them at? And I would add to Denise's question, are you directing them at the films or at the audiences?
I guess I don't know. I feel like I'd want to talk to Denise more about this question.
Okay.
Like, what do you mean by independent cinema? Like, and do you mean it like in a 90s sense, or like in a contemporary sense?
Right. Sure. Okay. In terms of your thoughts on each other's articles, I want to leave a space open if you had anything you wanted to raise with each other, because there was a lot of that kind of excitement when we were starting. But sometimes people are shy about doing that once we're actually here in the here and now. But as you're thinking about that, there's a wonderful question that just got posted into chat from Felicia Lowe saying, any suggestions on institutions to donate her film and video archive to? So, okay, all of you archive specialists, where should she go, or who will pay her for it? Both. Silence.
Lan's mic is not on. I think she was just saying something. Lan?
I don't have much to offer here, but I was thinking about the UCLA Film Archives and all the universities that are trying to archive this work.
Yeah. I want to add something. It's not directly to this question, but in a way back to the question of interviews that you raised, Brian. I think that the way that historiography has developed and the way research has developed in the universities and the academy, there's often a dismissal of the unofficial source that I think has diminished the status of interviews. And I think that this is a great moment to kind of shout out that it shouldn't be that way, that the primary research of tracking down individuals is just as important as looking through their papers after they're dead. And I think that's really crucial, and that there shouldn't be a hierarchy of what counts and who counts. And I've witnessed that over and over, especially with young scholars, that they'll be in the archive when the answer is down the street in the used furniture store. But just because that guy knows all these stories, well, no, somebody once said that to me, my professor wouldn't want to hear that from me. So I just want to say that it's really good to have a wide angle lens when you're doing research, and even when you're conceptualizing categories and modes of analysis, because only sometimes what makes it into the official discourse can be very narrow and very determined by that moment and what it prizes and what it disdains. So I think that your work is a great example of really casting a net into these individual histories, the films that were made in the past, the film festivals, the commercial as well as the anti-commercial works. I think it's so important the way that you're all approaching this and what you're finding, what you're bringing back.
I think this issue of what counts as credible scholarship is also related to different disciplines. I think film studies historically has not been the most as receptive to things like interviews, and perhaps it's because we're not teaching our students the tools and the methodology in a rigorous way. And so to be able to work with scholars from different disciplines can help bolster the credibility of our interviews and other kinds of scholarship beyond just close analyses of films, for instance.
Just to add to that, I find that archival work is really fetishized in academia. And I do agree with everything that's been said about ethnographic work or the interview structure. I think it's really helpful to think of it, then it allows us to rethink what counts as the historical record, and what is history, who's speaking of this past, when a lot of the histories that, at least what I'm doing, is a very present history, that that we're breathing history right at the moment that we're in it. So it allows us to, I think, rethink how we're doing history and what it means to do work in the archive. So yeah, I think that the interviews structure can be folded into films history studies. I don't think we have that much in our discipline. And just another point related to that is that I'm also in Vietnam studies, which is very post-Cold War kind of disciplinary formation that is so much area focused and so much about being in the archives, being able to read the languages. But so I really want to break apart that fixation too with the archive and what counts as archival work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're getting so much information from Renee on this chat. Well, I think you need to start a daily a show, Renee. It's called Ask Renee, and we'll hear all these stories about adventures with the archives and what happened, what didn't, what was hidden, what wasn't, what was left out completely, what was erased, who didn't give a damn. It's really great. That's I mean, maybe I'm just being told by Mark that we could unmute Renee for a minute and let her weigh in on some of this, because she's just come in with a comment about the Radcliffe archive. Do you want to say something, Renee? Is that something we can do, Christina? Ha ha. Okay, Renee, what would you like to say?
No, I'll just blog. I'll just keep on blogging.
Okay, all right.
Okay, bye.
Next time. We'll get you next time.
Okay.
And just a note, that question we had from Jason Alley asking the panelists, where do you think Asian American film and media criticism should be headed? So we've heard the complaints. Now, where are you going? What should people think about taking on? Great question, Jason. Harder. See, this is harder. Nobody's, okay, we'll come back to that. We're going to come back to that.
Maybe we could reframe it a bit. And I see Oliver.
Go ahead.
So it's also, I'm curious, like how you might characterize the changes in Asian American film media criticism. And again, criticism here, we can think about it in multiple terms, like there's journalistic criticism, there's also the criticism that scholars do. So maybe it's also not just necessarily where it should be going, but like where it's been, and then that might give us a sense of where it might be going.
One thing that I would like to stop seeing, and I really hope I'm not coming off as like the kvetcher in this mix, but especially around the criticism angle of it, is I would really like to see us is very amorphously defined here, defending or promoting things simply because they represent access to the industry if we don't actually necessarily believe in the thing itself. And I mean, especially in the past few years, whether we're talking about Crazy Rich Asians, whether we're talking about, what was the most recent example that was, it wasn't The Farewell, but I just feel like every 6 months, especially at this current pace, we're asked to basically be, oh, we got to get behind fill in the blank film or television series because it's being produced and directed and stars Asian Americans. And if this becomes successful, then this is going to open up more doors. And it feels like anytime someone wants to say, yeah, but this thing is not actually very good. I mean, and you can define good, whether it's aesthetically, politically, whatever else, it's as if we're somehow being bad Asian Americans. And if you've been around as long as a lot of the people in this panel have been, this is not new. I mean, this goes back easily to the 1990s, which is when I first encountered it, around the idea that we had to sort of line up and go see Joy Luck Club, whether we wanted to or not, because it was important. I'm sure it probably existed maybe in the 80s and 70s, even though I wasn't around to see it firsthand. And I think that it does us a disservice when we can't have honest discussions around what it is that's being circulating that effectively our names are attached to in an indirect way, simply because we're forever trying to break down the door into the mainstream industry, and to paraphrase what other of my colleagues have said in the past, because we want white people to respect our humanity. Like maybe we don't need to do that all the time.
I think this is tied to a question that's also come in. This is from Jackson Wright, specifically about Tiger Tail, and Tiger Tail has popped up in the chat as well. Is there something new about this, especially it being under the Netflix banner, or is this just another example of reinvention of wheel?
Anyone? You feel free to unmute yourselves and have your say.
I haven't seen Tiger Tail, sad to say, so I wouldn't be able to respond.
I guess back to the criticism question, kind of, I think depends what we mean by Asian American film and media criticism, because I don't think it's like a super, well-defined niche. Like maybe, like where would you go to find it? I don't know, like Phil Yu's blog or something, maybe.
Yay.
I don't know. reappropriate, maybe they would post something. So I'm, I don't know if it really needs to sort of become its own niche. But, I think it's, I think when we think about like the trajectory of like Asian American public intellectuals and the kind of, who represents, Asian American voices in the mainstream media right now, it is sort of like, Jeff Yang, this kind of like cohort of like Hua Su in the New Yorker, this kind of cohort of men in their 40s and 50s. So it will be interesting to see, who gets mentored into the next generation of like, public intellectualism. Will it,
I will
will
say
it
that
kind of, more men who, report on Asian American issues and then like write about basketball too, there is kind of niche, right? You have, Hua Su and others in those kind of prominent publications. So,
Yeah.
Thinking about places where women of color are writing about film, and a lot of it is just, on Instagram, that kind of thing, Twitter.
Speaking of hierarchies, Ryan, you were going to say something?
Yeah, and I'm curious about Lan's experience with this too. But so my experience as both writing about film as a critic, but also later on as a working in film festivals, we've noticed that there are no critics that come to the film festivals to write about the movies in terms of themes and trends, and even something as simple as, do I like this movie or not? The journalism around film festivals tends to be, I'm glad that this is happening and this speaks to me. But maybe what we're asking for is perhaps an interrogation of independent cinema beyond just that this represents me side. So I mean, Lan, is that what you're encountering at Via Film Fest as well?
You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think the kinds of media coverage that the Viet Film Fest gets is often, oh, look, this film festival, it comes around every year. Look at the diverse range of films, and then it's very congratulatory. There isn't a real analysis or even commentary about the politics of the film festival and what kinds of films are being submitted. And what I mean by that is, or the politics of circulation of these kinds of films. I think that the kinds of media coverage that we get is often very superficial and congratulatory. But I also see a value in having these kinds of spaces regardless, and having the audiences, speaking of different kinds of historical formations, having these kinds of audiences come together and have that face-to-face interaction and shore up a kind of community discourse about identity, memory, and culture. And the reason why I'm thinking of this is because one of the things that I really liked about the slideshow and all the pictures that you all showed, especially, is the kind of collaborative element that I see that really marks Asian American film history. And we don't talk about that enough, and the collective and the communal aspects of film and film watching and film spectatorship and film discourse. And I think that we don't have enough of it. So I would like to see in Asian American film criticism more of a conversation about all these different aspects of film, of media, of digital media. So I think we could just crack it wide open even further.
And I think a victim of this kind of lack of critical discourse around the film itself is regarding experimental film. And that how very often we're not talking about experimental film. And this ties to one of the questions from Patricia Zimmerman in the Q&A, which is how might we address the issues of Asian American experimental film and video beyond just narrative and documentary, which we have been talking about today. I will add that the one contribution that's not represented in our panel today was specifically about experimental film and video in the 80s and 90s. This is a roundtable that we did with Shuli Chang, Ria Tajiri, Radi Bogawa, and others.
Well,
But
we will, though. We'll tell people at the
Well,
end that in 2 weeks we're going to do another one of these with all of them. So there'll be a chance to address this. We won't be permanently discriminatory. But I just wanted to add one thing before we move on, in terms of how you relate to kind of the pop culture versions, the pop culture distortions and stereotypes, that and how you feel implicated as critics and scholars yourselves when you see this happening. And we did a feature online. We didn't have it in the issue because we wanted a really fast turnaround. But Film Quarterly on the website is still up there. Had Raquel Gates and Kristen Warner do a dialogue on how fed up they were with the reaction to Black Panther. And it was quite hilarious because it was all about the community outpouring of worship for this film that they didn't like and thought was bad. And so I think that sometimes there's a way to respond to those moments that's more than just fuming by yourself at home, or crying into your cocktail with friends, so that space is available. When the next time this happens, let us know, come on board. And I think people really appreciate having that unpacked and hearing what you have to say about the objects that are outside our grasp, right? Because they just float over the heads of critics and scholars and go directly to the billions of the mass market. So keep that in mind. Yeah. I want to just say that we've got about another 15 minutes left, so we'll try to get to some more of these questions. And if those of you who are attending, if there's something you've been wanting to put forward, go ahead. It's really, we'll keep this thread because it's really quite wonderful. It's really a rich mother lode of thinking about this field. Really terrific.
There's a question from Femme Haberer. She says, being a non-US Asian diasporic, I wonder, where do you see Asian diasporic transnational affiliations and solidarities happening in the cultural realm, or the possibilities of it?
Great.
Lan, you're muted.
So I'll take this one. I'm a Zoom newbie, so sorry. But I think this has to do with the question about what I think Asian American film and media criticism should look like. And that is that there could be a lot more interaction, conversations about transnational Asian cinemas and the crossovers, the collaborations, the kind of transnational structures of funding and support that make up these kinds of newer Asian American film products and media products that are coming out. Again, just going back to the Vietnamese American case, we have a phenomenon where the diaspora was born in 1975 after the war ended, but now we have many Vietnamese Americans going back to Vietnam in order to make films. And their films are being circulated in Vietnam, and they're highly popular, more popular than if they made films in the US. So my reading is that it's a critique of these Hollywood, of the Hollywood industry and how they're shut out as creative makers, but then also speaks to how the Vietnamese economy is now robust enough to have a kind of middle-class consumerism of films. What's interesting is the interplay between Vietnam and the diaspora. 45 years after the war has ended, what kinds of collaborations are now available and accessible to these populations?
I'm curious if Viola, this is a little bit out of the scope of your specific article, but are you observing also an interest in works like those by Spencer Nakasako in Southeast Asia?
Thanks, Brian. So I'm not sure about the how widely Spencer Nakasako's films have traveled outside of the U.S. So I'm not very sure about that question. But going beyond my article for this dossier and answering Feng Mei's question, I'm also a non-U.S. Asian diasporic, so this is always also in the back of my head when I think about films, cultural productions, And just thinking about all these different questions that are coming in, and taking Lulu Wang's The Farewell as an example, I think that's a good example, like kind of the current moment. I would be interested, or I have been interested, I'm someone who's interested in seeing like what kinds of similarities, parallels we can see between, you know, US produced films with those that are produced outside of it, like so the Asian diaspora, right? And also things that are made, for instance, in Southeast Asia, in places in Asia. And I'm thinking about, you know, specifically, I'm thinking about my work too, is that, you know, my work looks at the post, in the Cold War era, kind of this post anti-communist killings in Indonesia. And I try to find kind of similarities, parallels with things that are happening in the other parts of Southeast Asia. So it becomes really interesting to see how a film, like for instance, like Sri Minha's work, how does that, you know, relate to a film made by an Indonesian filmmaker about the same time, right? And so just trying to bring all of that kind of ethos, that kind of sensibility into the picture, I think is really valuable. And we are seeing this kind of moment in this digital age, of course, the age of streaming. You have Asian and Asian American films and Netflix and other streaming services. So we have a very global audience. And I think the topics have become also really global. Like Lulu Wang's The Farewell it's you know, it's talking to so many different groups of people, right? Not just Asian Americans, but also those who, the families that are back home, right? And so I think it's such an expansive time at the moment. There's so many different directions we could go to, but one of the things that I'm interested in is just finding all these different histories and how they are not just received, but also produced, and how they, you know, coalesce together in these ways. Because this is kind of the different technologies and also the politics of the current moment, I think, call for that.
I was just thinking too about this moment of Zoom, since we were just talking about some of the difficulties of Zoom. I do wonder if there can be an upside to it, to these transnational conversations. One of the things, the photos in the last article about the roundtable in the issue, literally the photos of all the filmmakers, Ria and her buddies, all like crammed together, all cuddly. You know, we wish we could virtually have that cuddly hang, you know, like with cocktails or whatever. But in that, I do wonder if these, you know, transnational conversations can be happening more, you know, through the World Wide Web. And also what I think the dossier does so beautifully is give us New York, Orange County, LA, San Francisco. There's a whole lot of other places in the US that must be having these festivals too. And we don't always hear about each other. So I wonder if this kind of Zoom format is opening up the chance for more of those national conversations and transnational ones too. Let's hope it could be a silver lining.
And just to jump in, May, who asked this question, is at NYU, and she should know that at NYU there are amazing, you know, international students in the BA programs and the MFA programs who are forging those connections right now. So it's also like about happening in the moment, and also thinking about what happens when, you know, in a particular case, something like Chinese international students come to New York, you know, want to get in the business, and then like enter these spaces of Asian American film festivals, and like how do they navigate that? How do they understand that? And I think Sylvia Chong's article on I'm forgetting the exact title now, but Who Killed Asian American Cinema, or The Death of Asian American Cinema. You know, she talks about the way that these kind of diplomatic, cultural forces, you know, the Chinese government, the Korean government, these kinds of soft power, they are now funding films from Asian American for Asian American film festivals, and how that's changing the landscape too. So that's another way to think about it.
That's great. As we're winding down, I don't want to miss this question from Abe Ferrer to the panelists, wanting to get your thoughts on how individuals and organizations insist on framing Asian American cinema in terms of diversity or representation, instead of how you see it in terms of vision, perspective, authorship? How do you navigate those two perspectives, those two lenses? Any thoughts on that? How do you turn that around? You're going to have to wait, Abe. You're going to have to write this yourself, I think.
I'm not sure about the question.
Yeah, it's what he wrote was he'd like to get your thoughts on APA cinema that is championed by individuals and organizations that insist on framing our cinema in terms of diversity and representation rather than a self-determined movement of vision, perspective, authorship in storytelling. So really, how do you escape the demeaning of the diversity category or the demeaning of seeing it just as a worthy representation? How do you get people to look at this in terms of what it really is, which is this very rich tradition in terms of vision, in terms of perspective, in terms of its own auteurism? How do you insist on that? How do you turn that screen around, I think is the question, if I'm understanding it right. But we'll move on. I just wanted to get that out there for people to think about. If you don't have an answer for it, that means it's a question ahead of its time.
Well, I'll say one thing, and I'm sure everybody's minds are doing this, but I guess some of that onus is on us to make sure that we are always talking about form, as much as content and things like that. I mean, I think it's so exciting to talk about the politics and the representation issues, especially for students who have never seen anything like this. I think that's critical. But to make sure that we're also talking about, I think again in that roundtable article, Rhea talks about first time she saw Cruising J-Town, how the form was so like something that she had never seen, and she didn't see it later until other more experimental documentaries. So to make sure that we keep highlighting, those dynamics too. I think that's obvious, but I think that's something that sometimes I get so excited in the other direction. Maybe I'm not doing as much work on. So I take that from you, Abe.
I don't want to put Brian on the spot, but this, you program a film festival, so I'd love to hear your take on this.
To me, diversity and representation are it's like grant speak. It's the way you get money, get resources. And if that's what it takes to get resources, I'm going to use these words. But if you think about like diversity and representation, it could be answered in terms of yes or no. Like you are either diverse or you're not. You're representing or you're not, or positive or negative. Whereas words like vision and authorship and things like that are get to the heart of why we watch movies to begin with, and sort of the unruliness of it and the excesses of these terms, and a certain kind of unquantifiability and unknowability, and sometimes unsettled, like a sense of the unsettled. And to me, as a film festival organizer, that's ultimately going to be that's why and how I program. But diversity and representation is how I get the money. Sorry, Viola, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, she was. Viola?
Sorry, I was just also thinking about very similar to thoughts to Josslyn. So thank you, Josslyn, for opening that up. But I was thinking in terms of aesthetics, and I think so beyond the content, I think it will be it's important too to show the different forms, like what are the aesthetics of Asian American cinema? What does that mean? And I'm thinking about, so coming here today, I was also thinking about other filmmakers like Greg Araki and John Moritsugu, so I actually taught John Moritsugu's Terminal USA to one of my classes. They were really shocked by it, and that was a different representation of Asian American cinema that they had never seen. And so I think having these like varied forms and aesthetics to talk about will make a very, I think it will give people a space to talk about the different kinds of visions, perspectives of Asian American cinema. And I also haven't seen Tiger Tail, but having seen the trailer, it sort of reminds me of some like the aesthetics of some Asian cinema, right? Too. So I think it then widens the conversation. It's like, what are the aesthetics of Asian American cinema, and can you make connections to, say, for instance, an Asian American cinema that's inspired by other filmmakers like Wong Kar-wai, for instance, right? Who's not considered Asian American, but who has influenced so many filmmakers around the world. So.
Great, great. And I just want to note that we've got some questions from Michelle Ruiz in Ecuador saying, what about third cinema? And is there any crossover between Asian American cinema and that? And then we had Renee popping up saying, somebody talk about Solanas and Jatino, exactly as if answering that question. So I think there's a lot of directions this can go in. I think you all have really started something wonderful. We're kind of coming to the end of it. But before we run out of time, I just want to say that 2 weeks from today, we'll have Vince Schleitweiler, Rhea Tajiri, Abby Sun, most of whom are here today in the room, are going to be up here on the screen, as it were, talking about the past in New York, talking about the 80s, a little bit of the 70s and 90s, and how this work came about, what the confluence of influences was back then, and that should be terrific. So you'll be getting a note about that. Also, there's been a lot of questions about where to find more writing, where to find yours and other people's, and I would say at least start by looking at the dossier. It's free online. Everything in Film Quarterly, all the way back since it started 60 years ago, is free online right now through the month of June. So check it out, see what we've been doing. I've been editing it for the past 7 years, but there's a long history. Also, if you want more on Asian American film, one that just comes to mind is that 3 years ago in 2017, we had an article on Emiko Omori and her work and how she started out as one of the only cinematographers and certainly one of the only Asian Americans in a newsroom or a public television station anywhere back in the 60s. So that's in volume 71, number 1, but go through and let's see if our keywords are any better than the other archives. I don't know. But you have all been spectacular. Are there any last words before I close this out? I want to leave the audience before the audience starts leaving us. So any last thoughts that you can't live without? No? You have been fantastic. You give me renewed hope that webinars can live on, and our attendance gives me renewed hope that people aren't sick of them yet. So 2 weeks from today, we'll try again. You've set a high bar, and it's just been thrilling. Brian, it's been great working with you on this dossier, and you'll be back in 2 weeks too. Okay. Thank you all. Thank you to Christina Rhee for making this possible, because we don't have the tech expertise. You've been great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.